Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Before she became one of the most recognized women in the modern world, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was simply a young girl growing up inside two very different worlds. One world was beautiful, elegant, and sophisticated. The other was emotionally fragile beneath the surface. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York, during an era when wealth, family reputation, and social image shaped nearly every aspect of upper-class American life. From the outside, her childhood appeared almost perfect. Large estates, horseback riding, private schools, beautiful clothing, formal dinners, summer vacations, and a family name connected to wealth and status. But appearances often hide deeper truths. Her father, John Verneau Bouvier III, known by many as Black Jack, was handsome, charismatic, and socially admired wherever he went. People were drawn to him instantly. He carried himself with confidence and charm, loved luxury, and moved easily through elite society. To young Jacqueline, he was larger than life. She adored him. Many people later believed Jacqueline inherited much of her elegance, wit, and love of sophistication from her father. But Black Jack Bouvier also struggled with alcoholism and infidelity. Behind the glamorous image was instability, arguments, absence, broken trust. Her mother, Janet Lee Bouvier, was almost the opposite in temperament. Disciplined, controlled, socially ambitious. She expected perfection from her daughters and believed appearances mattered deeply in American society. Jacqueline quickly learned that emotions were not something openly displayed. Composure mattered. Presentation mattered. Control mattered. As tension grew between her parents, Jacqueline watched her family slowly fracture. The divorce deeply affected her. At that time in American society, divorce carried enormous social stigma, especially within elite circles. Children were expected to remain graceful and composed no matter what emotional turmoil existed behind closed doors. Jacqueline learned very early how to hide pain behind elegance. That lesson would follow her for the rest of her life. Friends later described her as emotionally private, someone who revealed very little of herself publicly, even to people close to her. But behind that quiet reserve was an intensely thoughtful young woman. Jacqueline loved books almost obsessively. Literature became both comfort and escape. She read constantly: poetry, history, philosophy, European novels, biographies, art criticism. She was not interested only in beauty. She was fascinated by intelligence and culture. Teachers noticed she possessed unusual maturity and perception for her age. She observed people carefully, studied behavior, listened more than she spoke. Even as a teenager, Jacqueline often seemed older emotionally than those around her. She also loved horseback riding and became an accomplished equestrian. Riding gave her something she rarely found elsewhere in life: freedom, independence, silence. When Jacqueline was on horseback, away from social expectations and family pressures, she could simply exist as herself. Teachers and classmates often noticed there was something unusual about her. She was highly observant, witty, emotionally mature, and often far quieter than the people around her. Rather than constantly seeking attention, Jacqueline preferred to watch and listen. She studied people carefully, their expressions, their behavior, their emotions. Even at a young age, she seemed fascinated by the inner lives of others. But there was also a loneliness within her that never completely disappeared. The instability of her childhood, combined with the emotional distance she often felt inside her family, caused Jacqueline to become deeply protective of her private thoughts and feelings. Over time, elegance became more than appearance. It became armor, composure became protection, and privacy became survival. As she entered adulthood, Jacqueline attended elite schools and eventually studied at Vassar College. But one of the experiences that transformed her most deeply was her time in France. Paris captivated her completely. The architecture, the museums, the literature, the sophistication, the history woven into every street and building. France awakened something inside Jacqueline that would remain with her forever. She admired European culture deeply and became fluent in French, a skill that would later astonish diplomats and world leaders during her years as First Lady. But what mattered most was not simply language, it was perspective. Living abroad expanded the way Jacqueline saw the world. She became increasingly interested in art, history, philosophy, politics, and intellectual life. Unlike many women from privileged social backgrounds at the time, Jacqueline cared deeply about ideas. She admired writers more than celebrities, artists more than socialites, and culture more than attention. Yet even as her sophistication and intelligence grew, Jacqueline still struggled internally with uncertainty about her future. Part of her longed for a meaningful, intellectually rich life. Another part understood the expectations society placed upon women of her class during that era: marriage, presentation, social standing, appearance. These expectations followed women constantly. After returning to the United States, Jacqueline began working as a photographer and journalist for the Washington Times-Herald. She became known as the inquiring camera girl. The job required her to walk through Washington, D.C., interviewing ordinary people and photographing them for newspaper features. For Jacqueline, the work felt exciting and liberating. It gave her independence, purpose. But history was already pulling her toward a very different life. In 1952, Jacqueline attended a dinner party in Washington, where she met a young congressman from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. John Kennedy possessed enormous charisma. He was confident, ambitious, energetic, and came from one of the most powerful political families in America. People were naturally drawn to him, but behind his charm was intense ambition. Politics consumed the Kennedy family. Success mattered deeply. Power mattered deeply. Public image mattered deeply. Jacqueline and John were very different personalities. He loved attention and political excitement. She valued privacy and reflection. He thrived socially. She preferred observation over performance. Yet together, they created a powerful and fascinating image that captured public attention almost immediately. Their courtship moved quickly. In 1953, Jacqueline Bouvier married John F. Kennedy in a lavish wedding attended by politicians, journalists, socialites, and hundreds of guests. The media followed every detail. Even then, people sensed something unusual about the couple. Youth, beauty, ambition, elegance, charm. The marriage seemed to symbolize a new generation rising into prominence in America. But behind the glamorous public image, Jacqueline was stepping into an extraordinarily demanding world. The Kennedy family was not simply wealthy. It was intensely competitive, relentlessly ambitious, and politically driven. Jacqueline suddenly found herself surrounded by constant expectations, public appearances, political strategy, and growing national attention. At only 24 years old, she was entering a life that would eventually place her at the very center of history itself. And although the world saw elegance and glamour, Jacqueline herself was still quietly trying to understand who she truly was beneath it all. By the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy's political ambitions were accelerating rapidly. What had once been the life of a young married couple was transforming into something much larger and far more demanding. The Kennedy family did not think in ordinary terms. Everything revolved around advancement, momentum, victory, public image, and national influence. Joseph Kennedy, John's father, had enormous ambitions for his sons and believed deeply in building a political dynasty that would shape the future of America. Inside that world, appearances mattered constantly. Every speech, every interview, every photograph, every public interaction. Jacqueline was now expected to become part of that carefully constructed public image. But adapting to political life was not easy for her. By nature, Jacqueline was intensely private. Crowds drained her energy. Public attention exhausted her emotionally. She disliked superficial conversation and often preferred books, art, and quiet observation over political performance. Yet she understood something very important long before many others did. Image had power. Presentation shaped perception, and perception could influence history itself. As John Kennedy prepared to run for president, Jacqueline's role in his political future became increasingly important. Unlike many political wives of the era, Jacqueline possessed intellectual depth, international sophistication, and cultural refinement that fascinated both the American public and foreign leaders. She spoke fluent French, understood literature and art, and carried herself with a calm elegance that immediately distinguished her from traditional political stereotypes. Yet behind the scenes, her marriage was becoming increasingly complicated. John Kennedy's political career consumed nearly every aspect of life. Campaigns, travel, meetings, strategy, public appearances. The demands never stopped. There were also growing rumors surrounding John Kennedy's relationships with other women. Infidelity would become one of the great emotional wounds within the marriage. Jacqueline rarely discussed these matters publicly. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of her life was emotional restraint. She almost never revealed her deepest pain to the world. Instead, she maintained composure, grace, control, and silence. But privately, the emotional strain affected her deeply. At the same time, Jacqueline longed for something beyond politics. She wanted beauty, meaning, culture, family, a quieter emotional life than the relentless Kennedy machine allowed. Still, she remained beside her husband as his national profile continued rising. Then came the 1960 presidential campaign. The election transformed John Kennedy and Jacqueline into national celebrities. Americans became captivated by the young couple. They represented something different from previous political generations. Youth, style, energy, modernity. The country had never quite seen anything like them before. Television also changed politics forever during this era. For the first time, Americans were not only listening to politicians. They were watching them closely inside their own homes. And Jacqueline Kennedy understood visual presentation instinctively. Her elegance and poise became central to the campaign's public image. Yet behind the glamour, the campaign was physically and emotionally exhausting. Jacqueline was pregnant during much of the presidential race. She spent long periods separated from John because of campaign demands and health concerns. And while the public saw polished speeches and beautiful photographs, Jacqueline was quietly navigating exhaustion, anxiety, and the enormous pressure attached to becoming part of a possible presidential family. When John F. Kennedy narrowly won the election in 1960, everything changed overnight. At only 31 years old, Jacqueline Kennedy became the First Lady of the United States. Suddenly, the entire world was watching her. Every appearance became international news. Every outfit became a cultural conversation. Every public statement was analyzed. Magazines placed her constantly on their covers. Photographers followed her everywhere. Millions of people became fascinated by her beauty and elegance. But much of the public initially underestimated her intelligence. Many assumed she was simply fashionable and graceful. They did not yet understand how deeply thoughtful and historically minded she truly was. Jacqueline quickly began reshaping the role of First Lady in ways few people expected. To her, the White House was not simply a residence for politicians. It was part of American cultural identity, a living historical symbol connected to generations of national memory. When Jacqueline first entered the White House, she was disappointed by many of its interiors. Historical furnishings had been removed over decades. Important artifacts had disappeared. Rooms lacked historical authenticity. She believed the White House deserved preservation and respect as one of America's most important historical spaces. So she began an ambitious restoration project unlike anything attempted before by a First Lady. She immersed herself completely in the work, researching documents, meeting historians, studying antiques, reviewing paintings and furniture connected to earlier presidencies. She became deeply involved in restoring historical accuracy and elegance throughout the White House. The project was not superficial decoration. For Jacqueline, history mattered deeply. She believed Americans should feel connected to the nation's past through its cultural and historical landmarks. And slowly, the world began realizing that Jacqueline Kennedy was far more than a glamorous political wife. She was intelligent, cultured, disciplined, and quietly shaping American history in her own way. Behind the glamour of the White House and the admiration of the world, Jacqueline Kennedy's private life was becoming increasingly marked by emotional pain and personal loss. To millions of Americans, the Kennedy presidency appeared almost magical. Youthful, elegant, hopeful. The media often portrayed the White House as a place filled with energy, intelligence, and sophistication. But inside that world, Jacqueline was quietly enduring heartbreak that the public rarely saw. Motherhood meant everything to her, more than politics, more than fame, more than public admiration. She deeply wanted stability, family, and emotional connection in a life increasingly dominated by pressure and public scrutiny. But her pregnancies were often filled with difficulty and tragedy. Before the birth of her surviving children, Jacqueline suffered a miscarriage. Then another devastating loss followed when her daughter Arabella was stillborn in 1956. The grief affected her deeply. At the time, women were rarely encouraged to speak openly about pregnancy loss or emotional trauma. Many were expected to suffer quietly. Jacqueline did exactly that. She continued presenting calmness and grace publicly, while privately carrying enormous sorrow. In 1957, she gave birth to Caroline Kennedy. For Jacqueline, Caroline brought joy and emotional grounding during a period of growing political intensity. Then, in 1960, John F. Kennedy Jr. was born shortly after the presidential election. The image of the young Kennedy family captivated the American public. Photographs of Caroline and John Jr. playing inside the White House became cultural symbols almost instantly. To many Americans, the Kennedy family represented youth, hope, and a new vision for the future of the country. But even during these happier moments, Jacqueline often struggled with loneliness. The demands of the presidency consumed John Kennedy's life completely.